So it says that we're live, but I can't see or hear the room. So I'm not sure what's going on, everyone.
How about now?
We have a nice echo on this. There you are. Okay.
Hey, thanks for making sure we got our technology squared away. All right, so Chair Brickman, the floor is yours. We'd love to learn more about cleaning standards.
So I think I'm just going to provide some highlights and just some kind of thoughts which I'll characterize as kind of transitional as the bill works its way through the Senate, and some of the things that we left off on, and I'll leave it to Ellen to kind of go through the details of the bill. And I've got about 20 or so minutes before I have to run back to my committee. So just at a high level, I guess what I would start with is what the problem is we're trying to solve in this bill, and why
That's the best way to do it.
Well, why are we doing this?
The absolute best way to do it.
Why are we doing this now? Which is a question that I think has also come to members of my committee. And I think, as your committee knows probably better than any committee in the legislature, that there's a huge challenge in systemically supporting Vermonters in reducing their dependence on fossil fuels for heating. I know that this committee has worked a lot on issues around weatherization in particular. Reducing emissions and costs of home heating, we believe, are the hardest nut to crack, if you will, in terms of emissions reductions and some of the requirements that we have under the Global Warming Solutions Act. I think it's harder to do work in this space than transportation, than electricity, both of which are subject to regulation and equipment change outs that are more frequent. People replace their cars more frequently than they replace their furnaces. This is the hardest, I think, emissions issue to solve. And that's compounded by the fact that we have old houses in our state that are poorly weatherized. And then the question of why tackle this now? Why is this important to do right now? And why it can't wait? And part of the reason is because this is such a hard problem. It is going to take longer to solve. The longer we wait, the more disruptive, expensive, inequitable the solutions are going to be. And also, I think something we can't let slip from our vantage point is that absent a prescriptive, predictive policy, it's ultimately going to be left to the executive branch, the Agency of Natural Resources, to regulate our way out of this. We will have lost our chance to be prescriptive in a legislative policy sense. We will be abdicating our responsibility as legislators to the executive branch. So this is our chance to take a proactive approach. So the clean heat standard that's considered in this bill is the primary emissions reduction recommendation of the Vermont Climate Council. And the climate action plan that came out in December specifically says, and I'm going to quote it, it says to the General Assembly, adopt legislation authorizing the PUC to administer the clean heat standard consistent with the recommendations of the Energy Action Network's Clean Heat Standard Working Group. So that is very specific as to what the climate plan asks us to do. I don't have the quote in front of me, but I believe it also makes that request with a time constraint on it, which essentially says do this in 2022 for implementation in 2023, 2024. And that's essentially what H715 does. It is a clean heat standard bill that follows, generally speaking, the recommendations of that white paper. This bill started out in my committee in January at about a dozen pages. It's doubled in length because of some of the detail that we put around the policy that we would direct the PUC to implement. How this bill has changed from the original white paper, I think it's important to point out some of the things where we have gone, well, I would say that they're improvements, but we have moved away from some of the recommendations of the white paper. We've added requirements in this bill for life cycle emissions analysis of clean heat measures. We've added 1 year to the process of program design, public input, rulemaking, implementation for PUC. That was originally an 18-month period. We've expanded that to 2.5 years. And I can talk a little bit more about why we made those decisions. This bill is highly prescriptive regarding the type and volume of public outreach that is required during the program design and rulemaking process at the PUC. I think that's something we saw during the Climate Council's work in the last year, how important and frankly under-resourced the Climate Council was in terms of taking that public input. We want to make sure with a policy change this significant that there's a lot of opportunity for Vermonters and obligated parties to chime in as to how this is going to affect them and how to improve that process through the PUC's rulemaking efforts. We added in this bill a number of circuit breakers and cost containment measures, and I can go through some of those, but basically there's an allowance for the PUC to adjust credit requirements if there's adverse financial impacts occurring to Vermonters. There's this concept of early action credits, which essentially takes advantage of the huge amount of weatherization funding that we're pushing out into Vermont in the next 2 years before the implementation of the Clean Heat Standard. There's this concept of credit banking that we've incorporated into this bill, which allows obligated parties to generate credits when it's most cost effective to do that and then use those credits later on. It's something that's part of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative that has actually made that quite cost effective. There's this concept of a default delivery agent, which essentially acts as a cap on the cost of clean heat credits in the bill. And, again, can talk a little bit more about that. But generally speaking, what I wanted to indicate is something that we've added to this bill are a number of things that we feel fall in a kind of a cost containment circuit breaker category to address issues, very appropriate issues that folks have with regard to costs. I guess a final thing that I would leave with the Senate Natural Resources and Energy Committee is along the lines of, if my committee had another month to deal with this bill, there's more work we would do. And I think this committee is uniquely situated in a way that my committee was not to deal with some of these issues by virtue of you being the Natural Resources Committee and my committee kind of really focusing almost exclusively on regulated utilities. So, I will say some of the meat we have left on the bone for you all to chew on, I think, in this bill relates to, and actually in a number of areas that I point out. One that I think will be of no surprise if you followed some of the public debate here is with regard to biofuels and some of the work that you might do digging a little more deeply into how biofuels are characterized in this bill. Biofuels are referenced in this bill as needing to be sustainably sourced. And clean heat measures must be assessed for sustainability, but the concept of sustainability is not defined. So it's open to interpretation, frankly, by the PUC. So I would say that something you might explore if you're interested would be putting more definitional ballast, if you will, around the term sustainability. There was also a recommendation that came in very late, literally as we were voting this bill out of my committee, about should there be more robust intent language that gives direction to this PUC around biofuels and their sustainability. I think that would be added to this bill and something that you might consider. As I've mentioned, we had done work around life cycle emissions analysis of clean heat measures. My committee's intent was that all clean heat measures should be subject to life cycle emissions analysis. I've had some questions actually from a constituent I spoke to earlier this week with a question about, is electricity subject to life cycle emissions analysis? And my answer was yes, but I think there was some confusion around that. I think there can be some clarification that whether you're talking about a biofuel, a fossil fuel, electricity, and something that my committee discussed in some detail was even weatherization might be subject to life cycle emissions. There are some insulation technologies that frankly are fairly toxic stuff in terms of the petroleum products and emissions that occur when they're applied. So, I think the intent of my committee was that all clean heat measures be subject to life cycle emissions analysis, and that might be spelled out more clearly if there's confusion about that. There were questions around the default delivery agent. Something that my committee spent some time on was with regard to the default delivery agent needing to be able to provide a wide range of clean heat measures to Vermonters. There was a concern that the default delivery agent that was selected might only be able to support Vermonters in, for example, adopting clean cold climate heat pumps. And what we chose to put in the bill was that the default delivery agent would need to be able to provide a variety of things to Vermonters. A question that has come up that I've heard in the last week or two is, should obligated parties under this bill be precluded from being the default delivery agent? I think that's something that this committee might consider in testimony that you take. What I will say is that my committee did not want to go as far as to prescribe who the delivery agent would be in this bill. We were interested in this being a competitive process, and there's an important reason why I think it should be competitive, which is, actually I won't go into the detail now, but the default delivery agent, as I mentioned earlier, can act as a cap on the price for clean heat credits. And if that default delivery agent is competitively selected, presumably it will drive the price down of credits in the system. So I'll just leave it at, we didn't want to be so prescriptive as legislatively to dictate who that default delivery agent would be. But I think there's something there this committee might consider is, should obligated parties be precluded from being the default delivery agent? And then one final thing I'll mention, my committee spent a lot of time on the equity provisions in this bill and just transitions, and making sure that low and moderate income folks are going to receive a certain amount of benefit of clean heat measures as we transition to more weatherized homes, and homes that are moving away from fossil fuel as the source of energy to heat those homes. One thing I think we didn't do enough on was making sure that renters are supported very specifically. A significant portion of low-income Vermonters are renters. And while we called out low-income Vermonters as needing to be beneficiaries of a certain portion of clean heat credits, and while we do mention non-homeowners, I think that there's perhaps more detail that can be that can support that work. And again, these are questions that have come up in recent days as we review.
One thing that came up at the hall, if I may, was constitutional issues.
Mhm.
I don't know, did you mention that already, that there were some concerns about constitutional issues related to the bill? Has anybody come to you about that?
I can
I'm
only,
sorry if I've already
No.
covered that.
and I'm not sure if this is with regard to obligated parties and who's obligated to. Well, I'll tell you the one constitutional issue that we spent some time on here is, to the extent that Vermont can reach to obligated parties to regulate who is required to act under this bill. I think there was initially some concern that if the state of Vermont reached beyond its borders, to say that fuel wholesalers in Massachusetts or in New Hampshire or New York would be obligated, that would likely be constitutional overreach.
Thank you.
And so I think the question that where we've tried to stay within the constitutional and geographic parameters is to stay within the borders of Vermont.
Why would that, is that something to do with Commerce Clause issues?
Yep.
Okay.
There we go.
We have there are current obligations that are posed on out-of-state vendors and things. So there's certainly a track record for that.
And I think their obligation occurs when they sell in the state.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they may be domiciled elsewhere, which would be the case with this bill as well. There may be out-of-state entities, but once they actually conduct commerce within the state, that's when they become an obligated party.
So we just gotta watch that line.
Yeah,
Thanks. How much more time do you have?
I have 5 minutes.
Okay, just briefly, I'm getting objections to this bill on both sides. If I just look at the bill, I'm kind of impressed. But then you get the complaints.
Sure.
I'm getting complaints from certain quarters that it just falls short. That if we do everything in the bill, we're not going, it doesn't move us towards the climate goals.
Yeah.
There are people who are second guessing the biofuels.
Mhm.
And this is one that's actually I've been bothered by for years. Biofuels put carbon in the air, but
Sure.
then the other argument is it's a carbon cycle as opposed to sequestered carbon. The committee, I think, is going to need to explore that.
Yes, I
thoroughly.
agree.
Okay, and then there's also a fox guarding the hen house argument. That this just puts too much power in the hands of people who have a vested interest, a fiduciary responsibility to the stockholders to not be as green as they perhaps could be.
Mhm.
What I hear from the other side is, you guys in Montpelier are crazy, you're gonna bankrupt everyone in Vermont. So toning down from the hyperbole, I don't wanna go and cause unnecessary expenses to people who can't afford them.
Yeah.
So that's,
Yeah.
and maybe for it's only a few minutes, but
Yeah.
for future memos and stuff, that's what I'm gonna be exploring.
And I think, particularly to that last question, it's something that from a macro level, I think was on my committee's mind from day one. And I think one of the first places I start from that question of, whether the question is how much is this going to cost, or this is going to cost too much. I guess the corollary question to that for me is compared to what? Because we can choose not to act.
Right.
And then let's explore what that's going to cost us. And one of the things that I'd mentioned at the top of my testimony was, absent the legislature and the governor taking an active policy initiative here, what we are going to be left with a year from now, 2 years from now, and you should ask Secretary Moore about this, is leaving it to the Agency of Natural Resources to regulate our way through this issue. And that is a much blunter instrument that I think is less equitable. Frankly, it's less involved in terms of people sitting around this table considering, what the initiatives should be. And I think it takes less into consideration in terms of what the costs actually will be. So I think whenever I hear the question of how much is this going to cost, we also need to keep in mind compared to doing nothing. And so let's keep that on the forefront of our mind as we are active here. And I think that's not to dismiss that question. I think it's critically important from an equity standpoint. From the biofuel standpoint, again, I would point to this committee being the Natural Resources Committee as having, I think, unique capabilities relative to my Energy Committee in terms of digging into some of those issues. I think there is, plenty to be cautious about there. And again, that's why I would point out at a high level, my committee pointed to, any biofuels incorporated here would need to be sustainably sourced. And that would need to be also analyzed by the PUC. But I think more, as I said, definitional ballast can be put around what is sustainability and how do you characterize that in terms of what qualifies. I think, you're going to hear testimony from folks who will say that, biofuels come in a variety of shapes and sizes. Some of them are worse than fossil fuels in a number of regards, whether it's emissions or land use issues or water issues. But others, will reduce emissions relative to fossil fuel use and carbon intensity. So, I think those are things that you can really add value to this bill. And,
I appreciate your comment also, in terms of cost, when you said compared to what? The way I put it is, no plan is a plan.
Right, exactly. That's a choice.
And it's a very expensive plan. And it's interesting, people who have proposed that we do nothing, don't tell us how we're gonna pay for that.
Yeah.
And I think the implication is that it's not gonna cost anything.
Yeah.
And it's gonna cost a fortune.
I beg your pardon that I have to go to.
Yeah, I'll follow up with you and others. I'd love to learn more about the life cycle analysis, which seems like a key definitional thing, that for primary, secondary, tertiary, negative externalities, how many things get included or not included so that we really know what we're buying, basically. Okay, so thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you.
And with that,
Thank you.
we will turn to council to do a walkthrough of the bill. Good morning, Ms. Chakowski.
Good morning.
So we're aiming to get through in roughly 20 minutes. If that would provide the level at which you're walking us through. I know we will need more than one pass, so I know that 20 minutes is insufficient given the level of detail of the bill, but for getting us started, I'm hoping you can aim for approximately 20 minutes.
Okay. Sure, I didn't know that, but I will try. So then first, section 1 is a finding section. It heavily references the state's requirements under the Global Warming Solutions Act. Section 2 of the bill establishes a new chapter in Title 30, Chapter 94, the Clean Heat Standard. And so there are a number of sections added under this new chapter. But I'll start here. So the Clean Heat Standard is established under the program. Obligated parties shall reduce greenhouse gas emissions attributable to the Vermont thermal sector by retiring required amounts of clean heat credits to meet the thermal sector portion of the greenhouse gas reductions required under the Global Warming Solutions Act. The PUC is going to be the primary actor in this, the primary regulator. So by rule or order, the commission shall establish or adopt a system of tradable clean heat credits earned from the delivery of clean heat measures that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So this is requiring that the PUC develop a new type of credit. So this bill does not use existing RECs, renewable energy credits. It asks the PUC to come up with a new type of tradable credit for clean heat measures. Then those clean heat credits can be generated, and that is what parties will be used to meet their obligation under this program. An obligated party may obtain the required amount of credits through delivery of eligible clean heat measures, through contracts for delivery of eligible clean heat measures, through the market purchase of credits, or through delivery of eligible clean heat measures by the designated statewide default delivery agent. And the PUC shall issue orders and adopt rules to design and implement the clean heat standard. And so that's the really high level structure for this program. Then Next, in 8122, there are a series of definitions that are very important to understanding this program. So
Could we pause there?
Yeah.
Yeah, so for example, help me understand, describe to a constituent a clean heat credit. How it works.
help you understand what?
A clean heat credit.
Sure. So it's the first definition, but so it's a tradable, non-tangible commodity that represents the amount of greenhouse gas reduction caused by an action.
Okay,
And those actions, we're calling those clean heat measures. So
in sort of real world terms and real world experiences, how does that work?
yeah, so the obligated parties here are going to be fuel sellers, entities that sell fuel into Vermont.
Right.
So some of them are going to be selling natural gas. And so, or some of them are going to be selling liquid fuels. They're going to need to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions every year. Like under the renewable energy standard, the PUC is going to set an amount that each obligated party is going to need to achieve every year in emissions reductions. So, for example, for natural gas, the selling of biofuels will reduce emissions because it's getting away from the regular natural gas. But then there are other actions like weatherizing a house can reduce amount of greenhouse gas emissions because it's providing better insulation, and then less fuel will be needed to heat that home. In addition, cold climate heat pumps are another example. Installation of that will cause there to be a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So the PUC is going to establish a technical advisory group as well as hire a consultant. They're going to need to do a lot of math to figure out what actions cause what emissions reductions, how much of an emission reduction. They're going to create a schedule for how much reductions are earned per action, and that will then be tied to a credit amount. And so then people who take actions that are eligible to generate credits, they will generate those credits, and then they will either use those credits if it's one of the entities, or they'll be able to sell or trade their credits to other obligated parties who need them to meet their obligation every year.
Very helpful.
Thank you.
So remaining high level, clean heat credit is the primary sort of tradable thing that we're going to be using in this bill. They'll be similar to RECs, but this is going to be a new tradable commodity. And then, as I just discussed, clean heat measures. There are sections later in this bill that further direct the PUC to develop the tradable credit system, as well as the credits, but then also to further flesh out what are the clean heat measures, how are they measured. So that is discussed later in the bill as well. Chair Briglin did talk to you about this concept of the default delivery agent. This is one of the backstops in the bill. The default delivery agent is going to provide services that generate clean heat measures. This way, an obligated party doesn't necessarily have to do this work themselves to generate credits. There will be at least one entity in the state doing work to generate credits. So obligated parties will have the option of working with the entity to get credits from the work that they're doing. But also the default delivery agent will receive the enforcement funds essentially and use those funds to do clean heat work for low and moderate income Vermonters. There's a definition of entity. There's a definition of heating fuel because that is one of the primary issues in this bill. So we're talking about fossil-based heating fuel, oil, propane, natural gas, coal, and kerosene. And again, as Chair Briglin mentioned, the other significant term in this bill is obligated party. And so who is going to be required to have clean heat credits? There is some similarities, as I already mentioned, with the renewable energy standard. Under the renewable energy standard, utilities are bound to reach the renewable energy goals every year. Here, we are talking about a specific set of parties, the obligated parties. And so that is defined as a regulated natural gas utility serving Vermonters, or for other heating fuels, the entity that makes the first sale of heating fuel into or in the state for consumption within the state. And I did hear you just had a conversation about this with Chair Briglin. This is something we can discuss in further depth as we move on. And then just for clarity, there's a definition of thermal sector to make sure that it's understood that it's being referenced to the residential, commercial, and industrial fuel use sector as is used in the greenhouse gas inventory. So then 8123 starts with the clean heat standard compliance section. So the PUC is going to establish the number of clean heat credits that each obligated party is required to retire each calendar year. The size of the annual requirement shall be set at a pace sufficient for Vermont's thermal sector to achieve life cycle carbon dioxide equivalent emission reductions consistent with the requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act. So unlike the renewable energy standard that sets in statute the exact number of reductions or the exact amount of energy required, renewable energy required every year, this is directing the PUC to do some calculation on what the pace of the requirement should be in order to meet the Global Warming Solutions Act.
Can you say a little bit, maybe it comes up later in the bill, I don't remember at this point. This is only one tool in the toolkit for meeting the performance requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act and the statutory targets goals. So how does is there a mechanism that says we're not just going to rely on this and they might say we need to do more work in another sector like transportation in order to meet those goals? Is there a mechanism here to balance this effort relative to other efforts in terms of what the obligations for other parties might be in order to contribute to overall goals?
There is a report at the end of this bill looking at establishing the proportionality by sector under the Global Warming Solutions Act. The Global Warming Solutions Act isn't specific about sector by sector reductions. However, a lot of work has been done to establish what the current proportions of emissions are by sector. So I don't entirely understand your question because this is a program directed at Vermont's thermal sector. So I don't know if I understand your question.
Sure. So let's keep going. I think the question comes down to, in a way, for instance, this has happened in the electric sector. We said, why is the electric sector bearing sort of a disproportionate share of investment in cost in order to reduce greenhouse gases? Shouldn't the other transportation and thermal sort of pull their own weight? And so I'm just wondering how we balance out the efforts across all the sectors to achieve the overall goal, not rely on any one sector disproportionately.
So maybe I didn't read this clearly. So the requirement that the PUC is going to set is based on the Vermont's thermal sector contribution to the emission reductions necessary to meet the Global Warming Solutions Act. This isn't saying that that the clean heat standard reductions need to be set so high in order to reduce all of Vermont's emissions. It says right there that it's supposed to be proportional to the thermal sector.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm on page 5 of 25, and I think I've already been speaking for 15 minutes. So can you remind me what time I need to stop?
It's important for us to get the walkthrough. So let's go another 10 minutes, and we'll, rather than rush, we'll pause and reschedule more time so that we can do it more slowly. And so let's do that.
Okay. So the obligation that the PUC is going to set shall be expressed as a % of each obligated party's contribution to the thermal sector's life cycle CO2e emissions in the previous year, with the annual percentages being the same for all parties. So the PUC is going to, in theory, set a percentage reduction, and it will be the same for all parties. They will need to, hypothetically, like with the RES, the PUC may say something like, each obligated party is going to need to have a 4% greenhouse gas emission reductions this year as expressed in credits. So, and that will be based on their prior year's emissions based on sales. And to ensure understanding among the obligated parties, the PUC shall, in a timely manner, publicly provide a description of the annual requirements in plain terms, because this is a little bit complicated. The PUC may adjust the annual requirements for good cause after notice and opportunity for public process. Good cause may include a shortage of clean heat credits or undue adverse financial impacts on particular customers or demographic segments. Any downward adjustment shall be allowed for only a short specified period. So the PUC, as I've mentioned, is going to set the annual requirements for 10 years out. That's actually in the next paragraph. But they do have the ability here to adjust the annual requirements if there is good cause, like if there's a shortage of clean heat credits one year and no one can meet their obligation. And so to support the ability of the parties to plan for the future, the PUC shall establish the annual clean heat requirements for 10 years at a time. So with the required amounts being updated, so 10 years worth of requirements are always available. They'll do this every 3 years. So they'll extend the requirements 3 years, shall assess the emission reductions actually achieved in the thermal sector, and if necessary, revise the pace of clean heat credit requirements for future years to ensure that the thermal sector portion of the emission reduction requirements for 2030 and 2050 will be achieved. There's an annual registration requirement. So any entity that sells heating fuel in or into Vermont shall register with the PUC. The form and information required shall be determined by the PUC and shall include all necessary data to establish annual requirements. The PUC shall use the information provided in the registration to determine whether the entity shall be considered an obligated party and the amount of their annual registration. So what this is doing is it's actually saying that all fuel sellers need to register in Vermont with the PUC. And then from the information that they provide, the PUC is going to determine which of those meet the definition of obligated party. At a minimum, the PUC shall require registration to include the legal name, doing business as name, municipality, state, type of heating fuel sold, and the volume of sales of the heating fuels into or in the state for final consumption in the state for the calendar year immediately preceding. Each year, not less than 30 days following the annual registration deadline, the PUC shall share the complete registration information of the obligated parties with ANR and DPS for the purpose of conducting the greenhouse gas inventory and to meet the requirements of 591B3. So this program is going to generate a lot of data, and there is hope that this can be used to further gather data on for the greenhouse gas inventory, which will help establish what needs to happen in order to meet the Global Warming Solutions Act requirements.
And just to make sure I'm following, so there's an overarching target that the PUC is looking at for reductions in the thermal sector, and then depending on the volume of fuel sold and the type, which I guess really relates to its carbon intensity, each individual entity that sells into the state will have its own individual obligation defined for it on an annual basis. Is that right?
Yes, but it's going to be the same. And so if you think of like with the utilities under the RES, the utilities are of various sizes. And so they have a percentage requirement that they need to meet every year. And that is what is going to happen here as well.
Thank you.
The PUC shall maintain and update annually a list of registered entities on its website, and post on the website, except that the public list shall not include heating fuel volumes reported. For any entity not registered, the first registration form will be due 30 days after the first sale of heating fuel in Vermont. Clean heat requirements shall transfer to entities that acquire an obligated party. Next, another thing that Chair Briglin mentioned is the early action credits. So starting this year, actions that would generate a clean heat credit can be eligible for credits. So clean heat measures that are installed and provide emission reductions are creditable and therefore count towards the future clean heat credit requirements of the obligated party. Upon the establishment of the clean heat credit system, entities may register credits for actions taken in 2022. So what this means is at the end of this bill, and I've already mentioned it, the PUC needs to establish these credits, and then there's going to need to be a system for a trading, accounting, and monitoring of these credits, and that is going to take some time. And there's provision at the end for the PUC to hire a consultant to manage this. But starting in 2022, actions that will generate clean heat and therefore cause greenhouse gas reductions will be eligible to get credit. So any work that's done now, even though the system hasn't been set up, will be eligible to generate credits in the future.
So with the banking provisions, does that mean before the program were to come online fully, like 2 years out, that entities that will have obligations going forward could in essence do some credit banking in 2022 and 2023?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. With apologies to everyone, because we are short, we're on an up-tempo schedule. Just so that people know, as a morning committee, we probably have somewhere between 15 and 20 meetings left for the year. So
we just got our adjournment date, May 6th, so.
Okay, so it may be on the short end of that. So,
I know, right?
we will,
Hey,
I'd like to pause here at B, equitable distribution of clean heat measures, and then ask council, we'll schedule time to have council to come back so we can continue a meaningful, slower paced walk through the bill. But then we'll turn to interested parties and take testimony for the balance of the day so we can understand people's perspective on it, even if we haven't had completed the walkthrough. So with apologies to council, but we're in full court press mode. So thank you, Mr. Kowski. Your scheduled time to come back. And with that, I'd like to turn to Mr. Coward. Good morning. Good to see you again. So you just heard that our schedule adjustment. There's always going to be upbeat, and so you're I think of you as the architect of this bill. So can you give us your introduction to it?
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. For the record, this is Richard Cowart. I'm a principal with the Regulatory Assistance Project, a nonprofit based in Montpelier. We advise governments all around the world on energy and climate issues. And I'm also a member of the Vermont Climate Council. So I've been involved in work like this, and including in helping to design the Clean Heat Standard since the council was formed, and over the past year with the Clean Heat Working Group. And architecture is a good word to use here, because my intent this morning is to take you through, at a pretty high level, the major structural elements of the Clean Heat Standard. And I'm really happy to come back and meet with the committee at any time to discuss the details of all of these program elements, including, to answer some of the questions that have been raised already this morning. But I think it's a good idea to begin with just how is this thing put together? What are the major structural elements? The Clean Heat Working Group spent about a year chewing on this and coming up with a design. And the Climate Council, of course, endorsed it. The House has improved it. And I would say, just to be really clear, I think this is a sound structure. And I recommend that the Senate adopt a Clean Heat Standard essentially like the bill that is in front of you. I'm sure that further improvements can be made, but the basic structure is, we are convinced, the best way to go. Here, I'm going to take you through 7 things. So if you like to make lists, you can make a list of 7 structural elements of the bill. There are more, but I'm going to limit it to 7. First, it's a performance standard. In the climate world, in the world of policy, public policy addressing climate issues, there are numerous ways to approach public policy decisions that would reduce emissions. This is a performance standard. Why a performance standard instead of some other approach? Performance standards have been proven to be effective in delivering improved energy services in a variety of ways. The performance standard that we all know quite well is a renewable energy standard. Vermont's very familiar with this. Lots of states have them. By creating a percentage requirement on obligated parties over time, we have seen pretty significant improvements in the amount of renewables in the power sector. And really importantly, we have seen that creating competitive pressures underneath that percentage requirement has reduced the cost of renewable energy substantially. Energy efficiency in Vermont is subject to a performance standard. Then there are something like 25 other states that have performance standards to deliver energy efficiency services. So a performance standard for the delivery of clean heat is similar to those kinds of obligations. Element number 2, it's customer focused. When you think about renewable electricity, for the most part, these are things that can, where decisions can be made by utilities, and they can be, the renewable asset can be added to the transmission grid by the utilities, and end use customers pretty much don't have to do anything. What's dramatically different with respect to the thermal sector, which, remember, accounts for about a third, a little over a third of Vermont's climate pollution. What's different is that the decisions actually have to be made by individual customers, building owners, business owners, homeowners, in buildings, in the places where people work and live. And so it's essentially, if you think about it, it's the other end of the wire. It's not the utility end of the wire. It's your home, my home, and every place of business in the state. So this program has to be designed so that it works for customers. So I put on my customer hat when I think about all the design elements of this bill. I frequently say, this is basically a kitchen table conversation bill. At the end of the day, individual Vermonters are going to make decisions about putting in a heat pump, using advanced wood heat, talking to their fuel dealer about what kind of fuel is going to get put in the tank. Those are decisions made by individual people all across the state. So it's got to be customer focused. Moreover, it needs to be, the program needs to reduce emissions actually in Vermont. Global Warming Solutions Act is very clear that what we are about is reducing Vermont's contribution to greenhouse gases. And heating decisions, I say it's very obviously heat in Vermont is consumed locally. And what we want is clean heat consumed in Vermont locally. So this bill does not provide for any kind of offsets. We're not planting trees in China as part of this program. We are reducing emissions in Vermont. Third structural element, who are the obligated parties? As reflected in a question from the chair, I think a few minutes ago, in the electric sector, we have done a good job in Vermont of placing the obligation on electric utilities to advance energy efficiency and to advance renewable electricity. And we have made great strides in reducing emissions from the power sector, but we have not matched that in the fossil fuel sector. One of the principal structural elements of this bill is to put the obligation to clean up emissions from the thermal sector on the major actors in the thermal sector. So the obligated parties are fossil fuel sellers. The bill, because of Commerce Clause questions that were alluded to a few minutes ago, the bill is very artful in applying the obligation on, I use the phrase importers and wholesalers. The House bill uses the term first sale into or in the state. Similar language, by the way, is used in California and Oregon with respect to their low carbon fuel standards. And we've had a number of other instances where we want to make clear that we're covering all of the sales of fossil fuels in a particular sector, but we aren't overreaching and reaching too far outside the state when we do that. And I think this may be a subject that you want to look at carefully to make sure that the language succeeds in doing exactly what you want here. Program element number 4. This is an umbrella policy. In a way, this is one of the happiest parts of this bill, frankly. This is a part of the bill that just makes me smile. Going back to the overall purpose of the legislation, the purpose of the program is to reduce emissions associated with heat in Vermont over time in accordance with the mandates that you created in the Global Warming Solutions Act. And that's the goal. I started out at one point, I was asking myself the question, well, shouldn't we just like mandate a certain number of heat pumps or a certain amount of gallons of biofuel or a certain number of pellet stoves or something? Just count widgets or count gallons. And as soon as you think it through that way, you realize, well, that's not what we're about, really. What we're about is reducing tons. So what this bill counts is tons of emission reduction due to definite actions, which are called measures, definite actions taken in definite places in Vermont that will lower our emissions. So now, the good news is Vermont has a fair amount of experience doing some of these things already. We have an advanced wood heat program in Vermont. We have Efficiency Vermont. We have the utilities running efficiency programs and administering the tier 3 part of our renewable electricity standard. There's a lot of action out there. And those actions contribute to reducing emissions in the thermal sector. So don't they all count too? Not to mention individual actions that people may take to install a heat pump or replace a furnace with a pellet boiler. All of those things are counting towards reducing tons. Therefore, we count them all as part of the success of the program. And we feel perfectly happy to award credits to anyone who is performing those actions. So some people look at that and say, well, aren't you double counting? Because the utility is going to get tier 3 credits for doing that action, but you're also giving them clean heat credits. And my response to that is, it isn't double counting the tons. The tons are just counted once under clean heat credits. But the good news is that the utility may also be addressing a different policy objective as well, which is reflected in tier 3. So a part of the same is true with weatherization. We should be thrilled that the CAP agencies and others are able to reduce emissions through weatherization. And those reductions earn clean heat credits. And therefore they earn whatever clean heat credits are worth in the credit market, and they contribute to solving the problem. I'm happy to talk about this particular aspect of the bill at any time, but I actually think that as an umbrella policy, we can basically build on the multiple ways that we're already reducing emissions and could do more of that. Item 5, income sensitivity. This is a really important part of the bill. It's been a really important part of our thinking all along. It's been a very important part of the Climate Council's thinking about these programs. And let's just say that we know that making this transition is going to be making this transition is essential to meet our climate goals. And pretty much everybody has to be involved. At somewhere along the line, if you just look out in time, we are going to have to reduce emissions from buildings across the state, and that includes pretty much everybody's home. And my personal thinking about this, and I think the Climate Council's thinking about this, is, well, if we know we're going to have to treat everybody, why don't we start with those buildings that are the worst buildings, the ones that are most in need, and with the customers who are the most energy burdened by the existing system? And to make sure that there is a progressive focus on treating all Vermonters, or offering all Vermonters the opportunity to reduce their emissions and reduce their both indoor air pollution and outdoor pollution. The bill has a carve out for credits that must come from low and moderate income customers, dwelling units. And I strongly support that. We built that in from the beginning. I'd urge you to take a look at that, make sure that it's measuring things correctly. Structural element 6, a variety of clean heat options. I said earlier that you have to think of this as a customer-based program. Across Vermont, at least, my neighbors and lots of people have told me, some people love heat pumps. Some people really would much rather have a advanced wood heat system in their house. Some people are ready to weatherize their homes. Some people aren't ready yet. It's going to be a while before they are going to be ready for one reason or another. There are lots of ways to reduce emissions, and we are not picking technology winners just by naming them in this legislation. The way to win with respect to a clean heat credit system is to offer a clean heat option that customers prefer, to earn credits for it on a life cycle basis, and to deliver those savings over time. And I would like to have a long discussion with the committee about the different choices that are in the bill. And this leads directly to the item number 7, which is the common denominator. The common denominator on all of those clean heat options is life cycle analysis of greenhouse gas emission reductions. So I don't know how to overemphasize this. This is just a critical way of determining what the proper currency should be, if you want to use that term, or what the measuring stick should be. It's really a more appropriate term for measuring success with respect to the clean heat transition. Each choice that's going to be submitted to earn credits needs to be scored against against other options with respect to its life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. Some biofuels, as Chair Briglin said a few minutes ago, some biofuels score very poorly on this measure. Some biofuels score really high on this measure, actually. And other clean heat options can earn different scores according to the life cycle analysis. Now, life cycle analysis sounds really complicated, and it can be extremely complicated. I think someone earlier referred to, well, are we talking about tier 1 impacts, tier 2 impacts, tier 3 impacts, et cetera? We all know in the environmental world, everything's hitched to everything. And at some point you decide to cut off the scope of analysis. But the good news is that there's lots of experience out there in the world doing this. The state of California, for example, has a low carbon fuel standard. And the state of California, if you know anything about the California Air Resources Board, they have resources to study these things. And they have a list of fuels that have been analyzed on a life cycle basis for their purposes. And their purposes are pretty darn environmental for the reasons that they're doing the analysis in the first place. The state of Oregon uses similar analysis. And what you learn when you look at, and I would encourage the committee to look at different, look at how these different types of fuels score in these analyses. They use the life cycle analysis characterizations of a number of different fuels in order to score them for the purposes of their low carbon fuel standard. Oregon does the same. The Argonne National Lab and the National Renewable Energy Lab have done numerous studies to assess the life cycle impacts of different kinds of fuels. And by the way, this includes different kinds of kerosene, fuel oil, propane too, that have to be part of the comparison. And there's a huge body of peer-reviewed scientific literature on these topics. I'm getting to the good news for Vermont. The good news for Vermont is this work has been done. Many fuels have been assessed. We do not need to invent the wheel here. We can rely on, refer to, take note of the research that has been done in a lot of places on life cycle analysis. And that will allow us, and it will allow the PUC and the technical advisory group, the TAG, which you'll hear about, to score different fuels. They can score, as someone asked a little while ago, we can score the Vermont sources of electricity compared with the Vermont sources of fuel oil compared with the Vermont sources of wood pellets or biofuels. And that's essentially how it's going to get done. I think that I couldn't tell who asked the question, but somebody asked the question earlier. It's like, well, what do you say to a citizen about, well, what's a clean heat credit? And I think the simple answer is a clean heat credit is a measure of the amount of greenhouse gas reduction that comes from your decision to install a heat pump, buy a pellet stove, or talk to your fuel dealer about what they're putting in your tank. It's the amount of greenhouse gas reduction that comes from your choice. And I'll close with two observations about customers. You'll notice in this bill, there's no mandate for customers to do anything in particular. This is not a bill that requires anybody to rip out their furnace or put in a heat pump. It gives customers the opportunity to do so and gives them, in the final analysis, clean heat credits when they do it. The second point is weatherization. We know, based on the quality of the building stock and the age of the building stock in Vermont, that this has to be a two-part program. Part one of the program is weatherization, and part two is clean heat. The unfortunate physical fact is that only about 25% of the greenhouse gas reductions that are called for can be accomplished through weatherization alone. It would be nice if we could just weatherize ourselves out of this and totally eliminate our heat bills, but that's not going to happen. There is no way to reach the emission reductions required in Vermont, which form, Vermont's responsible answer to the global warming crisis. There's no way to meet those reductions by weatherization alone. And we know that weatherization and clean heat go hand in hand. A warmer home, once a home is weatherized, it's easier to do all the other work. On the other hand, until a home is weatherized, we still need to reduce emissions. So I'm urging you, as you think about this problem, to think about the weatherization legislation hand in hand with the clean heat legislation. And I'll stop there. Happy to answer questions and happy to return to answer more questions later.
Senator McCormick.
Thanks. Boy, we go back a long way. I think the first time I asked you this question was probably about 30 years ago. And you must be very tired of answering this question, but I've still never really come down solidly comfortable with the answer, and that is this. The clean credits. It appears to me that on the other end, what it does is it gives somebody out there somewhere an opportunity to buy a license to pollute. And that actually the net gain is canceled. That we don't actually have a gain, we just sort of break even. Can you
I'm
comment?
happy. I am happy to answer that question.
We've been
we're
doing that.
act- we and by the way, yes, I value our longstanding relationship in places like this. This legislation is measuring net reductions in emissions. It's not a license to pollute, it's a mandate to reduce. We are measuring reductions. It does not mean, I have to accept that when Vermonters buy and burn less oil, that oil might be burned somewhere else in the world. But this system doesn't license that burning. All we're doing is reducing our demand for oil. And of course, I don't know what they're going to do in Texas. I just know what we can do in Vermont. We can burn less oil.
Well, but someone's gonna buy that credit, right?
No, those credits are retired in Vermont. They're put in a grave in Vermont. They're not going to be sold to Texas or anywhere else.
So this is not cap and trade.
This is not cap and trade. It's a performance standard. Now, in order to allow flexibility within Vermont, you and I can trade credits between us, but at the end of the day, those credits are going in a hole in the ground. I would love it. You could have a vault in your committee room there. We could put all the credits in the vault and drive a spike through them. They're going to be retired.
Then where does the value of the credit come from? How does the credit have value?
The credit has value to the people who create the credit. That is a heat pump installer, let's say, or a weatherization provider, because the obligated parties, the fossil fuel sellers, have to acquire those credits and retire them. So they have credits, the credits are earned by the people who do the clean heat actions, and they are retired by the obligated parties who have an obligation to show that they have acquired that many credits. Now they can earn credits themselves, by the way, and we hope that that's a large part of what will happen. That obligated parties, it's just like, think about electric utilities and renewable electricity. They have an obligation to produce renewables at a certain fraction. They can trade credits, but they still have an obligation to add the renewable fraction to their mix. So the trading of credits isn't creating something out of whole cloth. It's just facilitating lower cost and more flexibility.
Okay, I know the committee is pressed for time.
Yeah.
And I actually don't understand this answer.
Okay,
And I've got to confess, when we just got the bill, I thought this was a cap and trade. So I thought I understood, well, this is something other than what I thought it would be. So if you could perhaps get us a memo or something, just explaining how the credits work. What makes the credit a credit? The cap and trade credit is that you can sell it to a polluter.
well, it's more like the renewable portfolio standard. So if you understand how the RPS works, this is akin to that.
One quick question on the credit. So if I'm a homeowner and I work with a local vendor, they install cold climate heat pumps. Who owns the credit associated with that action? Do I as the homeowner or the vendor that installed it?
The legislation doesn't specify this. I'm sorry,
Would you repeat that?
I'm a homeowner.
Yeah.
I install cold climate
Yeah,
heat pumps.
yeah.
Do I own those credits? Or does the vendor who installed them have those credits for having taken the action? Maybe at my request, but who owns the credit?
There are a lot of examples like this, today already. If we have incentive programs, for example, for the installation of pellet stoves in Vermont, and the program rules for individual programs sometimes specify that the performance incentive will be paid to the seller of the pellet stove. That's an example. It shows up in the contract between the seller and the customer as an offset to the price. So the value of the credit ends up in the customer's hands, but the performance incentive, technically the certificate, ends up in the in the stove seller's hand, and they take it to Efficiency Vermont and get the rebate. The same thing is true with respect to a lot of our energy efficiency programs. Who is getting the rebate for a particular kind of program? Some programs, by rule, give the credit to the seller, some give it to the buyer. My personal opinion about this in this legislation is that I believe the default provision should be that the credit belongs to the customer. The customer can just retire the credit if they want, or they can negotiate with the installer to say, well, okay, if I give you the credit, how much are you going to knock off the price? And that's what happens today with respect to these other kinds of incentives. Does that answer the question? And I think
that's very helpful. I mean, it makes sense that the value it begins with the customer's action. So there's that clear connection there. Let's go to Senator McDonald.
Okay,
and then
I'm trying to follow the money, Mr. Coward. So you go to Efficiency Vermont with your credit and they open up a trunk and they take out the money and give it to you. How do they fill their trunk with money available to give to the people holding the credits in their hand?
That's a great question. And the answer is the obligated parties, the fossil fuel sellers, have to buy those credits from Efficiency Vermont and retire them.
So fossil fuel sellers provide the cash for those people that make decisions at kitchen tables over what works best for them.
Correct.
They're gonna love that one.
Well, I'm going to go back to one of the principal points, made a couple times already today, that we have placed these sorts of obligations on electricity providers for decades. We have never placed a clean heat requirement on fossil fuel providers that's equivalent to that. And the clean heat standard is, and it is a program that would do that. It would place the obligation on the clean heat, on the fossil providers, akin to what we have done with power companies. Right now, actually, power companies under Tier 3 have an obligation to clean up their customers, some fraction of their customers' fossil sales. And we let the fossil companies off the hook for doing that. We could continue to put all these costs on the electric companies, but I don't think it's the best way to go.
Mr. Chair, in the example that Mr. Howard just gave, everybody who paid for the electricity provided the money for the electric credits. But everybody's electricity bills have dropped. In this case, everybody's electricity rates, instead of being the highest in New England, to now down to the next lowest, it's going to be a different measure of success. How do we sell that measure of success? It's more, I want to say, haphazard, or it depends on people that take advantage of it. It's not regulated, it's offered.
So that's really terrific way to frame the question. You're right that customers are not obliged to change what they do. The good news in this program over the long term, and this is the same as it is played out, I think it's similar to how it played out for renewables and energy efficiency for that matter. Over time, the overall cost of fossil fuel in Vermont will decline significantly. We're spending something like this year, probably $1 billion to buy fossil fuels to heat our homes and businesses. It's $1 billion mostly leaving Vermont to buy fossil fuels that, frankly, under the GWSA, we don't even want to burn, but we're paying good money to buy those fuels and burn them. Over time, replacing those heating sources with renewable electricity, advanced wood heat, clean, scored biofuels, and weatherization will lower our heat bills. And those heating sources are not only less polluting, but on the whole, they're cheaper. So we're going to be reducing the total Vermont heat bill over time. And we're going to be saving ourselves from the volatility of fossil fuel sources. And of course, we're seeing that volatility right now, big time. And that's the goal of this program. Now, we can't do it all tomorrow, so it's going to take a while to transition. But heat pumps are way more efficient than oil furnaces, and they're fundamentally more efficient. Wood pellet stoves are cheaper and more efficient than most of our heating sources. Their weatherization just reduces the bills overall and improves home health and safety and air quality. And so, sure, we're not going to do it by tomorrow, but over time, this is going to reduce Vermont's heat bill.
So I think let's wrap there. Mr. Du, so thanks very much.
Mr. Chairman,
Well, I'd actually like to just make one comment and move on, because we haven't had, So that the problem with not addressing this to me too is that we rely on measures like tier 3, where electric companies are obligated to achieve greenhouse gas reductions. We put pressure on the very fuel, electricity, that we're hoping to rely on more and more over time for both transportation and thermal sectors. So it's a very perverse, it's a non-incentive program. Mr. Duval has kindly offered to reschedule his testimony. And with that, we'll move to Mr. Lunderville to take us through till 10:15.
Even though you're here in the room, you don't mind?
I'm happy to.
I
Wait
read
till after the break.
Here's the note. Would
Oh,
you
I
like to
see.
read it?
Yes.
You have another committee. Stick to that. All right, let's go. Mr. Lunderville.
Good morning, committee. I want to make sure you can hear me okay.
Yes.
Nice to see everyone this morning, and thank you for the invitation, Chair Bray. And for the record, I am Neil Lunderville. I'm the president and CEO of VGS, Vermont Gas. And I've certainly been no stranger to this committee this year. But today I'm here to talk about the Clean Heat Standard, especially H715. And my testimony, I'll have some brief remarks and happy to take your questions, and we'll finish by 10:15. I want to talk about how I believe a well-designed clean heat standard will successfully transform the thermal sector. I'll talk about the ways that the House bill on clean heat standard represents a carefully balanced approach to meet the Global Warming Solutions Act targets and create affordable options for Vermonters. And then I'll close talking about the importance of passing legislation that ensures a fair, transparent process to implement the clean heat standard. So VGS has actively followed and participated in the clean heat standard development process over the last many months. We were a member of the Energy Action Network's Clean Heat Standard Network Action Team with other field providers, state officials, environmental stakeholders, et cetera. We have provided technical support and input along the way through the drafting of the Clean Heat Standard white paper, which was referenced several times this morning. And we presented testimony and shared our perspective during the development of the House bill. So I want to start this morning by reassuring Vermonters, our customers, that the things they love about the people who keep them warm in winters won't change with the adoption of a clean heat standard. At VGS, we will continue to focus on meeting our customers' energy needs every day, delivering exceptional service and adhering to our foundational mission of safety, reliability, and affordability. But in other ways, a clean heat standard will represent a profound and decisive shift in how we think about thermal energy, how we deliver warmth to our customers, that will reshape the industry to place our shared climate values on par with safety, reliability, and affordability. I think the question before us is not whether we have green energy or affordable energy. As Vermonters, we need both. And I believe a clean heat standard creates this opportunity in the years ahead. The proposed framework in H715 strikes the right balance of climate progress, energy innovation, and equitable solutions that spur affordable options. It would articulate the legal and regulatory framework that would guide the thermal sector as it transforms over the next 3 decades. If you can't tell already, I will say that VGS supports H715 as passed by the House. So from our perspective, the clean heat standard would open an exciting new chapter in VGS's long history serving Vermonters. And I want to mention this because I think it's illustrative of what the future might look like in a clean heat standard world. Back in 2019, VGS launched our climate plan to transform into a climate forward company, one that recognizes our contribution to climate change and matches it with near-term action to evidence this commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We are focused on 3 key areas as part of that comprehensive solution to transform how we deliver warmth. The first is something we've already heard. It is increasing our support for energy efficiency and weatherization, so we're reducing the overall amount of energy our customers have to use. The second is launching new in-home services that support customers with non-fossil solutions, such as electric heat pump water heaters and hybrid heating. And the third piece is diversifying our fuel mix to include low and no carbon fuels, such as renewable natural gas, RNG, green hydrogen, district energy, and utility scale geothermal. These measures and others, such as biodiesel, advanced wood heating, displace fossil fuels. They reduce emissions, and they're the types of activities that are contemplated under a clean heat standard. Now, the clean heat standard as presented in H715 would shift the thermal energy market to lower carbon energy through what I'm calling this carefully balanced framework. As you've already heard this morning, the goal of this is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions on a predictable pathway to achieve the Global Warming Solutions Act targets. Now, by setting clear and attainable targets, we are instituting a key element of this proposal. Making sure that we have a stable regulatory structure provides long-term certainty for fuel providers, and that certainty ultimately allows us to meet these challenges in a way that's more affordable for our customers. Each year, VGS other fuel providers will be able to employ a range of options, as Mr. Cowart discussed, that are scored using scientifically rational guidelines. This allows for real flexibility to empower innovation and achieve our goals. Finally, and I want to hit on something that Mr. Cowart mentioned, is that the clean heat standard is customer focused. It does not mandate customers change their fuel source, nor does it prescribe or prohibit households from choosing the right approach that works for them. So this brings me to an important point. The clean heat standard will only be successful if affordability is preserved. The clean heat standard is a fuel and technology neutral market-based approach where obligated parties like VGS would either develop the credits ourselves or purchase them in a credit market. This market framework uses the market forces to optimize for least cost credits that maximize emissions reductions. Now, this kind of integrated flexibility is a critical design feature of this approach and one that is really important. Now, the bulk of clean heat credits will likely come in the form of incentives to help families and businesses switch to cleaner heating options and weatherize to use less fossil fuel. Ultimately, this will help them save money on their monthly bills. This is a great feature of the clean heat standard. Incentive money flowing directly to Vermont families who can use it most. And it's the kind of investment that reduces the real concern of price volatility in the long run. But I want to be clear that the clean heat standard is not costless. While customers may choose incentives for heat switching or weatherization to lower bills, the cost of CHS compliance will be seen in fossil fuel price increases as a clean heat market is established and fossil sources are reduced. In our view, however, these price pressures are reduced, especially in the early years, through a number of provisions that are in H715. These provisions include things that have been mentioned today. A circuit breaker mechanism for the Public Utility Commission on their annual obligations. The establishment of a default delivery agent, which effectively sets the top price for a clean heat measure. The allowance for early action credits and credit banking, and direction for known annual targets that allow a non-linear ramp up. I'd say that probably most importantly in thinking about affordability is something that this committee knows very well and has taken a leadership position on, and that's weatherization. Now, the legislature, as the committee knows, is considering $80 million that the governor recommended in weatherization support. I think this is extremely important for the Clean Heat Standard bill. Clean Heat Standard and weatherization are highly complementary. The state's investment in weatherization will serve to reduce Clean Heat Standard cost pressure over the long term, because we know the greenest and most affordable energy is that which we don't have to use. Weatherization does just that. I want to just close out two other points. One is that a key element of the bill H715 is that it sets forward a carbon accounting structure that is rigorous, accurate, and fair. We've heard about the life cycle analysis, which is important that we have an established transparent process to do this. This life cycle analysis is an apples to apples comparison. It works from existing tested methodologies. And we think that is important that that is a good starting place by using what already exists out there in the market. Now, even with the rigor of life cycle analysis requirements that weren't part of the original white paper, we still think that H715's framework gives fuel providers flexibility to find least cost options, which will allow for that innovation to help the affordability of this. However, additional restrictions on top of what H715 has already put in place, additional restrictions such as the prohibition of biofuels or excluding certain measures based on carbon intensity, will impact pathways to meet the requirements of clean heat standards. It will reduce our flexibility. And in doing so, it will jeopardize the affordability, an outcome that we all hope to avoid. I want to close maybe with one note of caution along those lines and a few words of encouragement. My caution is that with a bill like this, small changes could have large impacts, especially on affordability. So any changes to the structural elements of the proposal, the committee should weigh very judiciously. In our view, H715 provides the adequate flexibility and appropriate guardrails to keep rates affordable for our customers. As you might expect, if we would need to reevaluate a clean heat standard bill through an affordability lens, if additional restrictions or changes are made to the current framework. I'll close with words of encouragement. I think that this committee is uniquely positioned to advance a well-designed bill into law, especially with the work that it has done, that you have done on weatherization. By looking at these together and making sure they advance together, we will get the best clean heat standard bill and the best weatherization bill that we can to help Vermonters. Time and flexibility are key. The sooner we take action to address thermal sector emissions, the better position Vermont will be to meet its greenhouse gas reduction requirements. This flexibility is essential to meaningfully and affordably achieving our shared goals. We think H715 meets these objectives as it currently sits. So with that, Mr. Chair, I'll wrap my testimony with thanking the committee for the opportunity, and we welcome any of your questions and the opportunity to work with you in the weeks ahead.
Okay, thanks for that testimony, which is very helpful, and for being so concise. I do have a question. You know, we've used it in the recent years talking about kitchen table counseling, for instance, and there's I think everyone in the committee has a sense of, and there was even a recent VPR, Vermont Edition episode on clean heat standard, and you heard those calls from people sitting maybe at their kitchen table saying, well, how is this going to impact me? So can you talk a little bit about the opportunity for, you know, at the homeowner level? I'm just wondering if someone is thinking about, for those who don't change, do you see higher costs for them because the fuel provider has to go acquire those clean heat credits? Or do you see it mostly being a lost opportunity, you know, an opportunity cost, foregone savings that they're not availing themselves of by participating, or maybe both?
Well, it may be both, Mr. Chair. That first of all, clean heat standard presents opportunity for Vermonters to make the change to cleaner burning options that are less climate polluting. To weatherize their homes and to unhook themselves from the roller coaster of price volatility that Vermonters are feeling right now very acutely with the prices at the pump. So this opportunity that the clean heat standard presents, I think, is generational. I mean, it is meaningful, and it will help Vermont across the board. There's also a cost to this. For Vermonters who don't wish to take advantage of that opportunity, the cost of the compliance for this will show up in the cost of fossil fuel cost increases. That's how the sort of the mechanism of how this bill works. Of course, we would hope, and we, as I can speak as VGS, we would be working really closely with our customers to make sure they're taking advantage of these opportunities, and not just, for all Vermonters should be taking advantage of these opportunities. When you couple that with the money that the legislature is thinking about for weatherization and other clean heat measures that are in the bills that are moving through the legislature now, I think that does help reduce the concern about cost pressure, especially in the early years. Remember, we have a couple of years until this bill would take effect, and then there'd be some time where anything we did for early action and any money we put into weatherization and other things would be able to be creditable. So I think as we look out in the next few years, the affordability concerns are not right on the front of this. There are a lot we can do right away to help, especially low and moderate income Vermonters, which I think is a really key feature of the bill that you're looking at today.
Okay. Well, and you mentioned the importance of incentive dollars right now. Well, could you speak to what those sources are now? I mean, we're talking, for instance, we're looking at ARPA funds. And so that's great that we have this windfall, in essence, that's helping, fund weatherization and other work. Can you talk a little bit about what the incentive dollars are now and where you think they will come, because ARPA is time limited?
Right. Well, right now you've correctly described. So there are incentive dollars through a series of programs, through the efficiency programs that are already run out there right now. VGS runs a thermal efficiency program for our customers. Efficiency Vermont, Burlington Electric run programs. There are multiple programs around the state that could help on energy efficiency and weatherization. That's simply through energy efficiency charges that are already existing. There are annual appropriations that come into weatherization. This committee knows well that there's not enough money going into weatherization. The ARPA funding, the 80 million that the governor proposed, the legislature is taking action on, represents another big chunk of money that can be used. Ultimately, there needs to be more money in that area. I think this is a place where the Clean Heat Standard picks up where these efforts are already leading us. The Clean Heat Standard will provide even more incentives that can match the weatherization money that's coming through, and any other funds that might come in through federal or state programs. We also know that we're talking about a lot of different groups of customers. Now, some customers, the low and moderate means, are going to need a lot of incentive. There are other customers that are already moving in this direction on their own. So we can provide a little incentive to them to make a big gain on reducing their carbon footprint. And I think it will take all types of these customers and certainly the whole range of Vermonters to be able to meet the requirements of this bill. But that's sort of the opportunity that the Clean Heat Standard unlocks here.
Great. Well, I think there is a temptation for, not unsurprising, for some people to do a lot of worrying over the costs, and it's appropriate that we're careful around costs. But we have seen with the RES, with Reggie, how a well-designed program that at the outset was, I think even the energy efficiency charge, people worried that it was going to have dramatic negative impacts, but when well-designed and rolled out at a cost, a careful scale, it's turned out to deliver benefits without the kind of economic negative consequences that people worry about. So we have a be optimistic plaque up in the room. We'll stick with that.
The positive economic benefits.
Yes. Right. All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Lenville. Good to see you. With that, we're going to take a quick committee break from now till 10:30, and we will resume testimony. Thanks to all our witnesses this morning, and thanks for moving right along.